In this and the next lesson, I'm going to go over the project files, 3D model details, and the necessary changes that I had to make to the character in ZBrush to prepare it for this course. These changes to the model were necessary because they presented some rigging challenges for the first rigging process. I will then close out the lesson by preparing the character model for rigging with Advanced Skeleton's cleanup tool. So I have a handful of Maya native files and one document for this project. I'm going to give a quick summary of each. So the first file I have holds some control curves that I initially created for this character to sit outside the master control. They will come in handy for some of the custom features I will be adding to this advanced skeleton rig. Next, I have 3 nCloth files that I'm calling nCloth rooms. These 3 files hold the final renderable jacket, distressed jean shorts, and sneakers. The jacket and the distressed jean shorts have been set up to simulate with an nCloth proxy. This was done in my Simulating Sculpted Clothing with nCloth course. The renderable version of these clothes are pretty much just wrap deformed to an nCloth proxy mesh. All N constraints that were created in that course to constrain the clothing to the rig have been deleted. This is because the clothing will now be simulated over an alembic result of the character's finalized animations. This is a workflow that allows me to use nCloth with a marvelous designer style workflow. This workflow reduces the burden of simulating dynamics and computing complex rig functions at the same time in the same file. If you haven't watched my nCloth course for the jacket and the shorts, no worries. I will be setting up the sneakers in a similar way in this course. Let's take a quick look at the new structure of these nCloth files. So in that nCloth course, you saw me wrap deform all these meshes of the renderable jacket to the nCloth proxy jacket. So if I move the vertices of the nCloth proxy jacket, it should move the renderable jacket's meshes and the buttons that are proximity pinned to the renderable jacket. And towards the end of that course, I created an attribute on the main rig to toggle the envelopes of the wrap deformers on and off. Now that this jacket is no longer connected to the main rig, I will have to recreate a separate control in this file that can be used to toggle the envelopes of the wrap deformers. Another thing I'm going to do in this file is reset the nCloth settings of the jacket. Now that I have better knowledge of nCloth settings that work best without slowing down the scene, I'm going to take another shot at setting the dynamics properties of the nCloth. In my nCloth course, you saw me crank up the resistance values to really high numbers. If you have watched my other nCloth tests for the anthro modeling, rigging, and grooming course, you've heard me talk about how expensive these values are and how there are better ways to hold the integrity of an nCloth simulation. The next file for this project contains all the articles of clothing that have to be wrap deformed to the character. These are her leggings, bra, mesh top, socks, and her gloves. When character animation is done, an alembic version of the character will come into this wrap deformation room, and the above mentioned clothing articles will be wrap deformed onto the final alembic animation of the character. This decision to make this room was just recent, as I have decided that I don't want the main rig file to do any processing of wrap deformations. This will keep the rig fast. The most complex setup in this wrap deform room file is her mesh top. Because of how complicated the geometry of the renderable mesh top is, it is wrap deformed to a simpler mesh, and that simpler mesh is intended to be wrapped onto the final character's body. This way, the body doesn't have to figure out how to propagate its changes to the complex net geometry of the mesh top. And in this course, unless the situation requires something else, I will be using the default settings for wrap deformations. So that is with auto weight threshold checked. Another important thing to note before we move on to the next file is that I went back to ZBrush to grab a higher resolution of her leggings. I will explain why shortly. The next 2 files hold the headphones, and the sunglasses for this character. These assets will be rigged last with separate advanced skeleton instances and then imported into the main rig file and constrained to the character. This seems like the smarter approach instead of trying to rig 3 advanced skeleton assets in the same file. Last, we have our main file that holds the character model. I'm going to talk a little bit about the meshes of this model and their render settings. There are 2 categories of meshes for this model: meshes that count on a displacement and or normal map, and meshes that don't, but that have to be subdivided at render time for smoothing. All this is achieved in the Arnold tab of the meshes shape node. Here's an example of the eye geometries that are subdivided at render time 5 times, but that has its height value set to 0 because it does not rely on a displacement map. On the contrary, we have the body that is subdivided at render time, and that does rely on a displacement map, so its height value in the Arnold subdivision tab is set to 1. These are pretty much the 2 types of scenarios that all meshes of this model will fall under. Everything has been labeled well in groups via the outliner, so if you ever receive this rig, just browse through the geometry folder to see what is what. These very low resolution proxy meshes are going to represent the nCloth clothing on the rig. The creation process for these proxy meshes is very simple. I just went into ZBrush and did a whole bunch of dynameshing and Z-remeshing in that order repeatedly until I had a clean enough mesh for my 3D application. My 2026 has a new feature, I think it's called voxel something or voxeling, and it merges meshes in the same way that Dynamesh does. And I think Blender also has a feature like this. So if you ever want to do mesh simplification in Maya or in Blender, you don't have to really go to ZBrush. It's just I feel more comfortable doing it in ZBrush. There are a few other lesser files that I should not leave out. I have this file called Y.E.S shading, and this file holds all the characters' shading. This is done in preparation for re-importing these shading networks to apply them to the final animation files of this character, which will be assembled with alembics that are exported from the rig file, nCloth rooms, and wrap deformation rooms. This is one caveat to using an alembic workflow to assemble your final animations. Alembics cannot export shading data or things like Arnold displacement settings. And the last of these lesser files is a file I'm calling Y.E.S Geo Groups. This file just holds the geometry grouping structure for this character. I did this because you will see at cleanup time that Advanced Skeleton does a thorough cleaning by exporting the mesh and re-importing it as an object file. This wipes out any nodes not supported by the OBJ format. So the grouping structure will have to be re-imported and set up after cleaning or after the rigging process is done. This last document contains the Arnold displacement data for each renderable mesh of this character. Once again, this is done in preparation to re-enter these values in the final alembic assembled animation files, and also for when a cleanup is run with Advanced Skeleton. These Arnold displacement settings are one of those material properties that will be wiped out by Advanced Skeleton. Yes, it's a pain, but one good thing I have to look forward to when re-entering all these numbers is the attribute spreadsheet. It will allow me to edit multiple entries at once. For the most part, all the settings are the same. It's the same subdivision type and almost always the same number of subdivision iterations. It's just that for meshes that just need to be subdivided at render time, but that don't need a displacement map, as I've mentioned previously, their height is set to 0. And by the way, setting all these settings is a task that can be designated to a script. What I will actually do is probably log all the commands from the script editor when I do it manually and just save that as a script that can be run to set all the Arnold displacement settings in a finished animation file. If I do this, I'll make sure to include a script with the rig for my tier 4 Patreon members who will have access to the rig. All right, so this video is now over 10 minutes. My new rule is to keep my videos anywhere from 8 to 10 minutes. So I'm going to postpone the rest of this lesson to the next lesson. So in the next lesson, I'm going to talk about the model changes and then I'll run the advanced skeleton cleanup process.